Well, finally, the last little bit that I'll talk about is another thing we hear a lot about, and that is the American Indians were great environmentalists. And the usual implication of this is that you, being non-Native Americans, are all pretty much terrible environmentalists, and you should be ashamed of yourselves compared to these people. Now, I am not saying this to disparage or make light of or make fun of American Indians. That's not in any way my intention. In fact, my view is that people who want to hold these people up as models of environmentalism are themselves really treating these people like children. I mean, they're not treating them like human beings. They're treating them like cardboard cutouts that they can use as bludgeons to bash the rest of us over the head with. They couldn't care less what the Indians actually did. They don't know anything about it, most of them. So, for example, one of the great scholars of environmentalism, Al Gore, was a... Now, that was cheap, totally cheap. But Al Gore, in his book Earth in the Balance, which came out when I was in college, he cited a speech from the 19th century Chief Seattle, who was in the Pacific Northwest. And in this speech, Chief Seattle talks about every single pine needle, every bug being sacred to him and his people. And, Al Gore is saying, if only we could get back to this. Well, it turns out this speech is totally phony. It was made up in the 1970s. The 1970s, like 100 years later, by a screenwriter named Ted Perry from Texas. Now, Perry just sort of, made up the speech, how he imagined it would have been, what this guy might have said. And then he saw that people were using it as if they were Chief Seattle's words. So Perry spent the rest of his career going around telling people, I made that speech up. I'm really sorry to break this to you, but I made that speech up. Well, Gore doesn't know this, so he's repeating it like this is from Indian wisdom. And this one speech bears a tremendous amount of the argumentative burden to prove that the Indians were all environmentalists. Well, the guy made it up. So anyway, Perry, this poor guy Ted Perry, makes up this speech, and he goes through his life thinking, well, maybe I've made good, I've tried to overturn this mistake. Well, there's a children's book that hits number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list called Brother Eagle, Sister Sky, written by some author, based on the phony Chief Seattle speech. He's going, oh, gosh, I can't. Then one day, Ted Perry is sitting in his own church, and his pastor gets up and says, as Chief Seattle said, he said, I can't believe this is happening. This can't be happening. So it just keeps going on and on. Well, earlier versions of the speech that we have are dubious for reasons of their own that I don't have time to get into, but I do talk about in the 33 Questions book. But when you look at it more closely, he's not saying every inch of ground everywhere is sacred to my people, such that we can only daintily touch it. He's not saying that. He's saying that specifically this land is sacred to us because our ancestors are buried here. Well, that's a very different thing from saying that land in general is a holy and sacred thing and no one can touch or do anything with it. So were the American Indians environmentalists? Well, like most people, they were good in some areas and bad in others. They were not, in fact, cardboard cutouts. They were not, in fact, ideological little creatures to be exploited by leftists today. They were actually real human beings, believe it or not. They were actual people. So yeah, they did do some bad things. They engaged in slash and burn agriculture. They wiped out entire animal populations because they were on the assumption that any animals that they killed in a hunt would be reanimated. So they didn't worry about killing animal populations. And they destroyed forests and grasslands. But at the same time, they were good environmental stewards in exactly the opposite way that we've been taught. We've been taught that the American Indians didn't know anything about property, right? We heard this a million times. And that the white man comes along and says, this is mine, and the Indian scratches his head. What could you mean mine? Everything is in common. Well, that's not true. First of all,